All right. Welcome back for our last session of the 40th Annual Demography Summit. Thanks so much of you for sticking around all day. Appreciate that and hope that this is valuable content for you all. So last but not least, on this whole trek of understanding data and using data is this whole concept of measuring and understanding community need. Now, Dr. Cog did a great job, Denver Regional Council of Governments did a great job leading into this conversation, really by playing with a tool and looking at a tool to identify levels of geography and all of those fun things in terms of reliability. But now, what about the question more related to, God, how do you even describe need and what are the right variables? And especially if you are trying to just run a program. All you're trying to do is run a program. So we've got a great panel for this session. We've got a couple of folks from our office, from Department of Local Affairs. So myself, we've got Dylan Stroder, Todd Bleeth, Marguerite Harden, all coming in from DOLA. Then we've got Ronnie Kumar, Margaret Horton from Colorado Department of Health and Environment. And then we've got Kimberly Davis coming back in from the Census Bureau. So just kind of set the stage a little bit for this. We are often asked to measure need for program planning and funding allocation. And I will tell you that we've been probably trying to do that, our office, for decades. And right now there's just heightened interest in looking at this because we've got a lot of interest due to COVID and a lot of dollars due to COVID. On top of that, a lot of state agencies and local governments are really looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion and different metrics and outcomes for looking at how we work with different communities. And I've talked to you previously in the last session about these data dilemmas. So how do we take all of that, the demand and need for data, for identifying communities that need, and looking at data dilemmas and strategically move forward? So I am going to pick on first Dion Stroder from Department of Local Affairs, really to give the perspective from administration, from leadership, on how do we do this?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hopefully you all can hear me. As Elizabeth said, I'm Dion Stroder. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at DOLA, and I have the pleasure of working with our SDO team every day on answering some of these questions and really thinking at a higher level of how we are determining whether or not we're meeting the needs of various communities across Colorado with our funding. We have a lot of dollars coming in through stimulus and recovery funds, as Elizabeth mentioned, and there is a requirement that we really take an equity approach when we're looking at all of these programs and delivering services, which is something that I think that we've been working on for decades, honestly, really trying to figure out how to right size the supports that we provide, the funding that we provide to match the needs of the community. And some of the challenges that we have are really trying to understand how data can support what we're doing and help us answer questions without falling into the trap of thinking that data alone is going to answer those questions for us. And so some of the staff that's on today will be talking from a program perspective of how we really define what we're trying to do. Some of the questions that we are trying to develop with every funding opportunity and with all of this work is really not only understanding who participates in our programs or receives funding, but also understanding who isn't participating, who's missing, who is not at the table. We have programs where by their very function are really serving the most needy communities, and yet we know that the utilization of those programs and services isn't always evenly applied. We know that there's folks who don't take advantage of the opportunities that we have. We know when we look at some of the maps for where we have distributed funding that there are communities that never seem to apply for funds or never seem to be part of the conversation. And so really our equity challenge is to figure out who's missing, who really should be at the table, who's out there that may be eligible for a resource, but for some reason is not participating and missing out on the opportunity to use those funds. We also think a lot about what narrative helps us identify those gaps. When we're doing an application round and we're asking communities to tell us from an equity perspective what they're going to be doing to meet their needs, we want to be able to give them technical assistance to help them describe to us what is it that they're doing to identify those gaps, how they're filling those gaps, and what kind of narrative would be helpful to us in being able to determine whether or not they really are having a strategic approach, or if they really are meeting the needs that they've identified. And so we've spent a lot of time really looking at that, how those narratives really shape up and how we can use data to help us support that. And then we talk about barriers that exist. Even when we have identified gaps, even when we have really done the work to look at the data and understand who's at the table and who's missing, we then need to really look at what are some of the barriers that are preventing people from participating. What's preventing some of the progress that we're hoping to make? What is it that a community needs that's not being met, that may be keeping them from moving forward? And how do we articulate that and use that to inform our strategies and delivering our programs? And then the last question is probably the most important, and that is understanding what needle we're trying to move. We use that term a lot. We're trying to move the needle. But the question is, what needle are we trying to move? What really is the outcome that we are searching for? And how do we know if this particular opportunity is going to help us get there? And how can data help us do that? And so these are kind of at the leadership level, the questions that we're asking all the time, that we're really asking our program staff to assist communities with when they're developing applications for funding, when they are requesting services, when they're distributing benefits. These are the types of things that we want to really develop. And so when we say that we have an equity lens, this is what we mean. And so these are really some of the key things that I think our staff is going to help us talk through how we are doing that at DOLA, but also how others might be thinking about answering some of these questions in their programs. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Super. Thank you so much, Dion, for your perspective, because I think it's at least especially on my end, we're always trying to kind of do it from the bottom up. We're looking at the pieces of data, and I think it's really nice to widen that lens and look from, the leadership perspective, and especially those questions that you brought in terms of, what is that needle that we're trying to move, and how can we maybe use this data or not to that story. So thank you very much for kind of starting us off on that bigger perspective. So the next slide I wanted to go into was just really setting the stage for how we talk about it in our office. We get a lot of questions, as you can imagine, over the decades in terms of looking at allocation of funds and how do we use different data to do that. And as I'd mentioned before, I think we've got this heightened interest simply because of COVID and the amount of dollars that are, coming into the state and into the country. And already a lot of those programs are pre-designed. Some of them are very general, and they are anything from like, the dollars need to go to communities impacted by COVID. And so they're very general. Others are incredibly specific. And we see programs anywhere in between, from very general to no poverty rate must be at 200% of poverty, for example. We also see in this what I call the naming the need game. A lot of times we have different words, yet the same criteria. Other times the same word with different criteria. And we've got a speaker later today that's going to talk a little bit, I think, more about that idea. But just in terms of, sure, everybody's heard a lot of these. We've heard it: communities at risk, disadvantaged, low income, economically distressed, cost burdened, just regular distress, disproportionately impacted, underserved. And then the one that came into my email box this week was a deprivation index. This can be overwhelming to a lot of program managers who their gift is in other areas than maybe, gosh, how can I find a number to show the community that I'm trying to work with? So how do we move forward understanding this kind of data and information overload? Well, in our office, what we like to do, if you've talked to us, we ask you always this. So what's the question? Is clearly and stating and focusing on the objective of the program. And then looking at criteria that might meet that need of that project. So maybe it's a transportation program or a housing or economic development. All of these may have different variables or criteria that might really influence that program. So it's really important to understand what that is. As you heard in the last session, One of my favorite variables is income, because it is really overarching whether or not educational attainment, single family household or single parent household, all seem to be related to this income variable. So that's, again, why it's one of my favorite, but it's also important to be looking at, is it an individual that you're looking at addressing, or is it a community, which may change that variable that you want it to use or look to identify need. And also, is your goal to prioritize? Like you've got a bunch of dollars, you need to prioritize how that's spent. So you need to look at worst off to best off. Or is it simply a yes, no, you meet the criteria or you don't? Or let's just say, gosh, I just want to see who are we meeting with these dollars and who aren't we? I really just want to understand my community. So general information, not specific criteria per se. What we always say is keep it simple, because actually you're going to be in charge of communicating these variables, these criteria to whatever constituent base you are involved with. Just like Dr. Cog was mentioning, they go out and they have community forums and talk about things. You got to have to explain it. So if you make it a very huge convoluted formula, harder and harder to communicate, potentially to also update. You don't want to make it too hard on yourself. And often you don't need to duplicate variables. I was working with a state agency several years ago, and they had 3 different income variables. They had like free and reduced lunch, poverty, and income, all for the criteria. And I was like, so can we just pick one? Much easier to update and use. Also, Dion got into this, that geography really does matter. And we talked about with Dr. Cog as well, not all variables are available or acceptable for use for all levels of geographies. I love the takeaway from Dr. Cog. Let's use tracks. I am much more of a fan of tracks. I don't think that we're going to have as good fitness of use for block groups. And I still think, even though Mary kind of gave a nice notice that we might not see differential privacy as it's been used, this top-down algorithm on the ACS, there's still a chance that something's going to happen to make that data even worse at that block group level. Biggest one, and this is what's related to what Dion was mentioning about equity among geographies, is always be looking at who are some of these communities that qualify for programs but don't participate, and how do we maybe look at those a little bit differently. So we know that there's data issues. We know that there's margin of error issues. We know that there's stability issues. Certainly, you don't want to change criteria for a program every year if people have to do program planning. We know that we've been working with different agencies, for example, CSBG, Community Service Block Grants, and they only change their variables either once every 5 years, I believe, with their new plans, because local governments have to do some planning around and have at least a little bit of idea of stability of, do they qualify for a program and at what dollar amounts? And also totally always understand what is that variable measuring and be informed. So poverty, even though it's one of my more favorite variables, it really is based on a national threshold. And does that make sense to use in a community that maybe has lower cost and lower wages? So it doesn't take into account that cost of living. Unemployment, again, it tends to be a favorite for a lot of people, especially in the economic development realm. But the sample size for Colorado is only about 800. So if you're trying to use a county level variable with unemployment rates, that is very unstable. And it maybe makes more sense to use a 3-month running average, 6-month running average, in order to understand how maybe unemployment's changing at a county level. There's also a really fun one. I do like it. It's called the Social Vulnerability Index that's out there. It's multivariate. There's probably 15 to 20 different variables that create the whole index, which I think that's a problem to explain. You get a variable somewhere between 0 and 1, and try to explain that to somebody. What does a 0.8 mean? What does a 0.6 mean? How does that make them more vulnerable or less vulnerable? And it's also indexed to the Colorado average. So if you are in the Denver metro area, you could actually end up, it not being an adequate variable to understand a community in the Denver metro area, because you're measuring against yourself, against the entire state, rather than looking at maybe just a community within, let's say, Denver or within Adams, etc. Same issue I think happens with median. I still like median, but it only describes the median. It doesn't tell you what the tails look like. And especially if we're trying to understand the lower tail, understand that distribution of lower income. Is a lot of people at zero, or is it evenly distributed across that lower income component, for example? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd from our office to demo a little bit of research that he's been doing, looking at a lot of the different variables out there and what he's seen mapping wise.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. So yeah, I've been diving into some of the statutes here and trying to figure out well exactly how many different variables there are, how many different measurements there are, and try and put them all on a map basically, because that's what I care about. There's a lot of the variables out there that apply to individuals. I'm a geographer. I'm not the demographer in the team, so I'm more interested in the spatial aspects. So right now I got this tool that I'm working on. It's not released yet. We'll try to get released in the near future on the website, but for the moment, it is basically a measurement of the different variables I have found, both on the state level and on the national level. So first, if you want to see the layers that are involved, currently there's these layers here. So it's over a dozen so far that I've identified. And even if you see an arrow within these, then there's actually more within those as well. So there's a lot of potential variables out there. I'll dig into those a little bit for you here in a minute, but first I want to also show you, basically, I want to give you a description of these variables. And you can see that looking by clicking on the measurement descriptions here. And I'll zoom in on this for you a bit because it's hard to read. So this is going to be basically a description of all the different variables that are on the map, giving you a very brief overview of them, the exact measurements that are used. So in the case of disproportionately impacted communities, it's using block groups, under 40% households that have income that is less than 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, or under 40% of households are minority, or over 40% of households spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And we'll, like I said, we'll do that for all these. We'll also include a link to the actual information for each of these variables. And we go back to the map here. Get that zoom back out. And I'm going to go actually pick on the disproportionately impacted here in a second, but I'll show you some of these other ones here first. So environmental screen, this is basically something from the federal level. It's an environmental justice screen, and there's a number of indexes here. These are mostly just basic statistics. So this one might not actually end up making on the final map. But so you have a demographic index that basically takes all these and ranks them as far as, like, if you have a large number of people of color or a large number of people under age 5, that type of thing. National Risk Index, this is actually basically measuring the risk of disasters, floods, hail, and that. And I have it filtered out so it's only showing the high and very high areas. So you can see where that covers. The CDC social vulnerability that she was talking about, Elizabeth was talking about. This is just showing the ones that are actually at 0.75 or higher on that scale of 0 to 1. The Department of Transportation has an index that they've created in response to the Justice 40 initiative by the Biden administration. And this is showing those tracks that end up qualifying under that. And hub zone, that's a HUD based measurement. Got another HUD-based measurement here with the qualified census tracts. We also have another one with the racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. You can see it's actually not that many in Colorado that qualify. Most of them are in the Denver area. Colorado Viral Screen, this is from CDPHE, and this is just filtered out to show the census tracts that are highest on their measurement. Colorado State Revolving Fund, this is actually set up to provide low income loans for water infrastructure for communities. And this one, I've got showing which ones qualify on the census tract level, but you can actually qualify on this one on any of the different census tracts, place, block group, or county level even. Again, all these on this map, we're going to have all these measurements fully described over here in the measurement descriptions. And then now I'm going to pick on this disproportionately impacted. So this is one that was actually passed, I believe, in the last legislative session. And it's the basic measurement is whether they're over 40% cost burdened, over 40% minority, or over 40% under 200% of the poverty level. Problem is they did it at the block group level, and they said based on the latest census. Well, the latest census doesn't have that data. So you basically have to go to ACS data in order to see this. So I decided to do it based on the ACS data in 2018, 2019, and 2020, using the same criteria. And you can overlay these to see the difference. So in this case, any block group that's in green qualifies under both 2018 and 2019. Any in yellow only qualified under 2018 data. Any in blue only qualified under 2019 data. And then we also have it using the 2020 ACS data. And again, more differences. So you have some red ones up here, for example, that are only qualified under 2020. And you do have a few that are overlapped, and those are the dark red ones. Now I'm going to pick on Lake County, unfortunately. This is the county here. Basically, these block groups right here are Lake County. So under 2018, they qualify under every single one. Use 2019 data though, and only these 3 block groups qualify. Use 2020, and only these 4 red block groups qualify. So you see that you get to using block group data and it gets to be an issue. And actually, I want to show you basically one of the criteria in there is housing burden. And within that is rent burdened. So these are 2 of the block groups that are in Lake County. These the 2 ones on the outside here. And just to give you an example of why you really shouldn't use block group data if you can possibly avoid it. 2018, you have estimated 108 renters in one of the block groups, 132 in the other. And you can see the margins there, 68, 52. So plus or minus 68, plus or minus 52. Switch to 2019, you have 121, 187. So suddenly you have 55 more listed in 2019. And then you go 2020, and you have 33 for the first block group, as opposed to 19, you had 121. Basically, don't use the block groups if you can possibly avoid it. And that is what I want to show you. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Super. Thank you, Todd, so much for sharing that. And so again, I think that identifies one of the challenges, right? Is if you've got 3 different ACS sources, all called census, then will you start seeing cherry picking from communities saying, well, no, but we qualified in X, so let's use that one. So again, it's not that I have an answer, but that we do have these dilemmas. out there that I think, as you know, a lot of us here are data users and data supporters. How do we start working more strategically moving forward so that it's not a lot of brain damage that's done on a regular basis, but that we just think more strategically about how we use and address data in this piece. So now what I'd like to do is bring in another data user. Marguerite Hardin has been running a program for DOLA and having to deal with these issues of disadvantaged, maybe, community. She's been running 2 different programs, actually. So Marguerite, tell me, how have you done with this?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Let me just share my screen here. Great, so just a little bit of background as to why I was invited into this panel. And very humbly, I have been applying this criteria into a planning process, and we're in the process of applying it to a grant program. But we have just had a lot of lessons learned through that process. And in talking with Elizabeth about this panel, she really rightfully called me a poster child for overthinking data. And I do agree, I am a data nerd. I think it's very interesting. I understand the limitations of data and trying to translate that into a program. And I just feel fortunate that over the course of the last 2 years, I have been down the hall from the SDO and been able to pick their brains and really have them help me learn through this process as to how we use the data and help local communities use their own data to forward a lot of this work very earnestly. So I will share with all of you some of our lessons, and hopefully you don't get so bogged down in the data as I did in trying to translate this into a program. So just a little bit of background about me and my office. I work for the Colorado Resiliency Office. I'm the local resiliency manager. So I work with local governments across Colorado on helping them prepare for shocks and stressors and be able to recover and be more resilient to future uncertainties. And we are guided by a 5-year plan. This is our resiliency framework. And we take a very systems thinking approach, which is really that image on the right there, which you can see social equity and the unique community needs being one major facet that all of these sectors and all of the systems thinking work that we do is really deeply embedded in. And we, for a while, for years, have been using this resilience prioritization criteria to help us understand what projects are more resilient than others. And social equity is one really big piece of this. And so IDEA, which is the acronym I will use for this work, inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, is a really big and integral part of resilience. You cannot have a resilient community without having thought about your social equity and your social vulnerabilities in your region. And so we have applied this criteria to a number of grant programs, not just the ones I'm going to talk about today. And we also really are doing a lot of training in rolling this out to other state agencies to be doing this sort of resiliency thinking across grant programs. But again, social equity is a big part of this conversation. And so I'm not going to dive deep into the background of the programs that we have been working with this work on. I'm going to talk more about how we have applied this social equity thinking to our work. But just suffice to say that there have been 2 major programs that I have managed or am managing as we apply this work. And the first is a planning process. And we've been working with over 150 jurisdictions and their partners throughout rural Colorado on regional planning that is taking in the lessons from COVID and applying them to future resiliency, and really taking a visioning and long-term approach for that. And we are currently about to launch Microgrids for Community Resilience program, which is a grant program. So just a big difference as to how you would apply social equity and some similarities between a planning process where the goals might be more process and learning versus a grant program, which may also have some of that process and learning, but will also have some really tangible funding outcomes that relate back to IDEA. And so more information on those programs at these links that are in the slides, but I'm just gonna move on and talk about kind of the really basic big picture way I find helpful to think about incorporating IDEA into any program. And that's who you're going to be engaging and how you're going to be engaging them. And in working with the SDO, I really have enjoyed learning from Elizabeth and her saying, okay, I get that you're digging into the data, but what is that going to translate to? You know, how are you going to access those communities once you know that they're vulnerable? And so really thinking about not just who is vulnerable, but how you're going to engage them, what proxies exist, what community engagement exists, and not just doing the data for nothing. And so really tying those two questions together and keeping that longer term, how you're going to be engaging the communities in mind while you're digging into who you want to be engaging. So I will be framing the rest of this presentation around that who and that how. And Elizabeth already kind of referenced this, just that there's a lot of different words and definitions for all of these communities. And, you know, she likes to say, you know, see the forest from the trees, don't let the tail wag the dog, which is a really great way of saying, don't let the data just control your work, let your work control the data. And so not getting bogged down into those different words and definitions, but really coming back to your program and what those intentions, your vision, and your goals are. And so with this planning process, the Roadmaps program, that slide to the bottom right corner here, that image, really, we needed to document that up front of why are we doing this work? Why are we trying to understand who the most vulnerable communities are? And what were our goals? And we had the 3-part goals of a planning process of learning together, that process and engagement, as well as the outcomes, not just engaging those communities, but also ensuring that there's strategies to make them less vulnerable. And so documenting that internally and also sharing that externally was a really important part of that process. And also just not reinventing the wheel. You know, the definitions we ended up using were from the DOLA website, were from the federal government. And so that Roadmaps Inclusive approach is our public-facing way of defining that. It was our way when communities say, why are we doing this work? You know, leading them to just a few quick slides that really crystallized the purpose, intention, approach, and the goals of that work and getting them on board. And really not assuming everyone knows the same thing. You know, you might be diving into this data, you might know a lot, but I think there's a lot of learning in this space right now, both within your team and with external partners around what all of these words really do mean. And, you know, I have a link here to a comparison of major resilience indices. And you can see a number that were mentioned today by our census speaker. Todd just showed a few of these in map format. And it gets back to what Elizabeth was saying of really make sure you understand what the indicators are using, what variables are there. And, you know, me diving too deeply and getting too nerdy about the data really led to this this table that anyone can look at that really breaks down all the indicators that are a part of these. And there's really these top 7 metrics that all of them most commonly use. And so even though there's probably some variation as to why, you know, when you're looking at wildfire risk, you know, they include a metric that's not included on this slide around, do you have your own car? How much of the population has their own car, which for wildfire risk is very important around equity. You know, if I was running a wildfire program, I might really want to have that metric in there. But for most others, I think that these top 7 can really capture the big picture as to who these populations are. And, you know, that other link at the bottom of this slide gets back to a community resilience and assessments actions guide that we've developed that allows you to use some of this data and links to the data sources for setting baselines, setting goals, and really understanding the needle that you're trying to move. And as we're thinking more, we didn't use these tools during the planning process, largely because they were not available during the planning process. And, you know, there's been a lot of, I saw a question in the chat earlier about, you know, the state's push for including DEI or doing this work. And really a lot of this push has come from the federal government, which is important to realize that it was with COVID stimulus dollars that disproportionately impacted communities was a term that was first used, but it wasn't fully defined at first. And there's a lot of confusion around how do we align this broad definition with this term. And now you're seeing with IIJA and the infrastructure bill at the federal level, a lot of work around Justice 40 and what that means. And, you know, we're going to be pursuing with the Colorado Energy Office to leverage some of our microgrids dollars for some of the federal infrastructure dollars. And they are requiring that you use either Justice 40 metrics or something that is comparable to that, which Colorado EnviroScreen is. And so we're currently in the process of understanding how we're going to use these tools. But I will say that even the Justice 40 tools, there is one that was released by the White House and CEQ, as well as one that is coming out of a national lab that predated the CEQ version. And you can see that they're slightly different. And so when we're thinking about a grant program and how we apply point basis or advantage or prioritization with some of these tools, we are going to really need to understand what our goals are, what the threshold is, if we, you know, how much priority we want to give to these. And also, you know, the J40 maps really clearly show like a yes or no to a disadvantaged community, whereas Colorado EnviroScreen shows more of a gradient. You know, we can set our own definition of 40% or different percentages, or you know, do we want the most burdened or do we want just above average burdened? And so we'll be playing around with that as we define the parameters of this grant program. Now getting back into the how do we engage and how that ties into the data. You know, this slide has a lot of information, but you know, that planning process and with a grant program is just really thinking about integrating idea throughout the process. And so with the planning process, we created data packets, we shared them, we discussed them, we coupled it with ground truthing, which we've heard about in today's conference already. We have used that in order to inform who we need to engage, who is not at the table. And then that has ultimately gone back into data-informed decision-making. I think it's just really important that you don't just stop at creating the data packet, but you really internalize what that data means. You know, I've seen a lot of different consultants use this data, and it's really the translation of the data into a story that really mobilizes those local communities, really making that data meet the local context and need that the communities have. And so allowing those local values to lead the process and not the data. And so, you know, we do the same thing with climate change. We don't necessarily use the term climate change if that community does not want to talk about climate change, but they do understand that they have a statewide drought that is going to threaten their agricultural sector or whatever it is, you know, or if it's extreme heat or floods. And so you can do the same thing with equity to understand that maybe they don't want to talk about EDI, but they do want to talk about, you know, having a healthy community, you know, reducing poverty and homelessness, and really having other community values at the forefront. And so again, translating that data way into takeaways and actions. Not everyone is a data nerd. Engaging partners, sometimes proxies. Not every process is going to be doing the direct community outreach, but who can you engage to represent these groups? And really understanding that you need to move at the speed of trust doing this work. When there is a lot of pressure for what are the outcomes? What is the needle you're moving? Really understanding that sometimes just bringing those partners to the table in a more meaningful way and having them there informing your work into the future is a really big win. And then in a grant program, we're lucky because the microgrids program is brand new. It came out of House Bill 22-1013 this past legislative session. So we really get to cut this program from a clean cloth and from the onset, understand how our program intention and design can incorporate idea, and building that into the eligibility. I'm really excited. We'll be requesting letters of support to really showcase some of these partnerships and requiring these partnerships with community partners, allowing it to guide selection, whether that's points, using the mapping tools we discussed. You could reduce match for some of these communities. And of course, beyond just managing the funding, there is building the pipeline of projects into the funding applications, ensuring that we are targeting our outreach to these communities that are often underserved and low capacity, and therefore might need additional technical assistance and help in strengthening their applications. I should just note that we have a public hearing on November 17th to really share our approach with the microgrids program. And so while these are some ideas that we have for incorporating IDEA into the program, we have not committed to one quite yet. Finally, these are some other engagement lessons learned, and I just wanted to bring it back to this framework to develop a liberatory consciousness by Barbara J. Love, and focusing what I've mentioned here of don't get stuck in analysis. And notice that this is not a linear process. This is a cyclical process that it starts with analysis, but it gets into accountability, action and allyship, and it really starts with awareness, but it continues as your awareness grows and as you build in that analysis. And then over here, you can just see some of our lessons, which I've mostly already mentioned, but really keeping that fact that communities are more than just data points as you move forward. And finally, some next steps that I have, again, revisiting, incorporating this into a cycle, not a linear process. We'll be sharing case studies as to how we did some of this work. We have already been hosting a local exchange around some of the lessons learning through this process. And I'd just like to say I'm open to a kind of exchange with other state program managers. My email is here in this PowerPoint, but I'm always learning from other program managers and other departments who are also, federally required to be incorporating J40 or other tactics. And finally, we at DOLA, and I know a lot of other state agencies and departments across the state have this requirement, but to have a lot of this learning translate across different programs, and we're doing that through some program self-assessments. So I am sure I am at time. There is my contact information, and thanks so much.
Super. Thank you so much, Marguerite, for sharing what you've done. And I will tell everyone she has been a great partner to work with. And yeah, we might pick on each other a little bit. She makes fun of us, we make fun of her, but it's all in good fun. And it really has been one of the most engaged people that we've interacted with in terms of truly trying to understand what all of this is saying. So thank you so much for being with us. And hold on, because I think we're going to have some questions for you, but she shared her information for anybody else going through this process. Marguerite is a really good example of someone who has really had to go through these different cycles and processes to understand what's going on. So next party up is our team from CDPHE, Department of Health and Environment. As you heard, they were referenced several times with Colorado EnviroScreen. So Ronnie Kumar and Margaret Horton, sorry, got the two H's mixed up. Let us know what you're doing with Colorado EnviroScreen and how people might be using that and looking at it.
Yeah, great. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Ronnie Kumar, and I am the Environmental Justice Research and GIS Analyst for the Environmental Justice Program at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And I'm going to pass it over to Margaret to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for sticking through to the bitter end of today. It's been a really great day of programming, and we're excited to share our work with you. My name is Margaret Horton. I work at CDPHE as an environmental epidemiologist for our Environmental Public Health Tracking Program. And today we'll be talking about the Colorado EnviroScreen tool and the environmental justice initiatives that we have going on at the department. I'll pass it on to Ronnie to get us started.
Perfect, thanks. So like Margaret said, today we're going to be discussing Colorado EnviroScreen, and I've really appreciated all the conversations that everyone's been having today, because this fits in with the discussion of disproportionately impacted communities, and also has this extra specific layer of environmental justice in Colorado. So sort of this mixing of policy, data, and environmental justice communities coming together for this topic. So go ahead to the next slide, Margaret. Ultimately, what we're talking about and representing is this new environmental justice interactive mapping tool that CDPHE, in collaboration with Colorado State University, developed over the last year. It was launched in June. And what it does is it maps out, it aggregates 35 different indicators related to environment, public health, demographics, and climate vulnerabilities across the state of Colorado to show cumulative impact, or cumulative environmental impact across the state. So that's the sort of main driving data behind this tool. But as we'll see, it ties into a lot of the other topics that we're talking about today, is particularly related to this concept of defining a disproportionately impacted community. And just for further context on sort of the scene of environmental justice mapping, Colorado has now this developed state tool. California EnviroScreen is another similar tool that's been around since 2013. The Environmental Protection Agency has EJScreen, so that was what Todd was referring to with the different indexes for the environmental justice screen. And the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, just released their own environmental justice index. So there's a large universe of mapping tools. And when it comes to environmental justice, one of the things that we'll be talking about is the need for granular data, and often state-specific data, to really talk about community level environment and community level environmental justice concerns. So the intention behind Colorado EnviroScreen is to have this mapping tool for Colorado to talk about Colorado's specific data and Colorado's specific environmental justice concerns. So going on to that, we will be going a bit deeper into the Environmental Justice Act, which we've seen referred to already for that disproportionately impacted community definition. Then talk about that definition for DI community specifically, and Margaret will walk us through more in depth about the background and Colorado EnviroScreen as a tool. So for environmental justice in Colorado, the House Bill 21-1266 was passed in 2021, set a legislative definition for environmental justice at CDPHE and for the state. So effectively, this sort of mandates CDPHE to continue to systematically address equity and justice through the administrations of its programs. And I would like to highlight here that, there's a lot of terms that get used, but environmental justice is specifically looking at, population level impacts versus when you hear like equity, diversity, and inclusion, that's more specific to internal, human resource often sides of a program. So when we're talking about environmental justice, we're talking about sort of statewide, looking at how pollution or other health disparities are playing out across the state. Okay, next slide. So within that House Bill 21-1266, we declared environmental justice as a state policy for Colorado. It created two EJ entities. The first being this Environmental Justice Action Task Force. That is actually wrapping up here at the end of mid-November. They have their last task force meeting next week in Pueblo, and we put links for those who would like to attend or register to give public comment, and to also read the draft recommendations. But ultimately, this task force was put together to provide further recommendations to the legislature. It also created an Environmental Justice Advisory Board that will look at longer term projects. We have the Colorado's first environmental justice ombudsperson now within CDPHE. And lastly, importantly, it defines disproportionately impacted communities for the state of Colorado. And so I guess to be clear, it does define a DI community currently for CDPHE, but the task force is looking to recommend this definition be taken across other state agencies. If you look at the general legislation for defining DI communities, say for Colorado Department of Transportation, Public Utilities Commission, or the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, you will find that all of that legislation defines a DI community at the block group level. So this definition is consistent with that. So for this EJ Act, the first criteria for a DI community is a block group that is over 40% of a household or a population is low income, identify as people of color, or are housing cost burdened, and those are the ones Todd walked through. The second prong that would meet that is that an area would have a history of environmental racism perpetuated through those various actions. And then the third prong is where we get into this concept of cumulative environmental burden and socioeconomic burden, which is where the Colorado EnviroScreen tool comes in really for that third prong to think through what that looks like at a state level. So I'm going to hit it. Oh, so the map on the right also is displaying what that first prong looks like, where block groups are over 40% of those three demographic indicators. One, I guess, clarification is that the task force is now recommending that they use the ACS 5-year data. So that measurement is out currently that we're using is the 2015-2019 5-year ACS data. And they are recommending to use the 5-year ACS as the database. But I'm going to pass it over to Margaret to go more into that cumulative impact and that cumulative environmental stressors.
Thanks, Ronnie. So I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about the Colorado EnviroScreen tool itself. And really the purpose behind the tool is to help us implement that Environmental Justice Act by identifying and visualizing places that have experienced environmental health disparities throughout the state. And so we're going to take a quick look at the tool itself just to get everyone oriented. We developed it in partnership with CSU, as Ronnie mentioned, but it now lives on our CDPHE website, and we will continue to maintain it here on this CDPHE location. The first thing I want to point out is that the tool and all of the supporting materials are completely bilingual. So if you or any of the people in your program or your community need a Spanish language version of the tool, you can access it here at the top of the landing page. And then down here, we've got some resources for first-time users to get oriented. But by clicking on that green box, you'll be taken to the tool itself. So the tool was built in the R Shiny platform, which is an open source data platform. All of the code is available on GitHub for anyone who wants to review it, take it and run with it and make it their own, or do anything like that. But what this really allows us to do is create a tool that is very flexible and customizable to the needs here at CDPHE and of our various users. So this is the first version of the tool. It launched at the end of June of this year. And so we have a long list of items that we would like to update and make improvements on. But the general tool will remain the same for at least a year or so before we make additional updates. But scrolling down, we've got a bunch of resources up at the top here. And then about halfway down the page, we've got the map itself, which is really the main event of the EnviroScreen tool. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that the map is very customizable. We've got the data available at 3 geographic scales. at the county level, the census tract level, and the census block group, largely because of that disproportionately impacted community definition, which is mandated at the block group level. And then users can also customize the data being mapped. So it defaults to the EnviroScreen score, which is that cumulative environmental impact score. But users can also map any of the subcomponent groups, like environmental exposures, or any of the individual input data sets, like ozone, fine particle pollution, wastewater discharge, or anything, any of those other 35 data indicators. So the map here, let's set it to the census tract, and then you have to click Update Map, and the map will reload at the specified geography. So you can explore the map by clicking on a community, and that community will be highlighted in these various histograms so that users can see where that particular location compares to the rest of the state in terms of the most environmental burden or the least environmental burden, or cumulative environmental burden, I should say. The other thing I'd like to point out is that we've got a variety of additional data layers to help provide context. So users can also map the disproportionately impacted community definition, specifically the demographic component. So that's that first definition that Ronnie talked about just a few minutes ago. And again, this is using the 2015-2019 5-year ACS estimates. Users can also map the White House version of the Justice 40 layer. Marguerite, I did not know that there was another version out there, so that's good to know. And then users can also map or can view story maps that we've created in partnership with the CU School of either Journalism or Sociology or both. I think the lead professor is appointed to both. And so, as I think Dion and Marguerite both mentioned, creating that individual, narrative or that local narrative is really important. So, folks here at the CU School of Journalism or Sociology or both created these story maps about certain areas in Colorado, and we hope to expand out to other parts of the state as well. And that's to create more of a complete picture of the environmental context in those specific locations. We also have all of the data available in a data table below. And so there's really a ton of information here that I really encourage everyone to go and explore. But for the sake of time, I'm going to leave it at that. I do want to talk a little bit about the EnviroScreen score itself. So it is, a conglomeration of 35 individual data indicators, which are all kind of grouped into these purple buckets on the bottom row. So we've got environmental exposures, things like air quality and water quality, environmental effects, something like a Superfund site or a landfill that might be in a community, but that most people aren't interacting with on a day-to-day basis, and climate vulnerability related to wildfire risk, floodplains, extreme heat days, and so on. And then we've got the health and social factors. Our sensitive population data refers to health outcomes and the very young and the older populations, because we know that these characteristics can mediate a way that a community can respond to environmental pollution or environmental and pollution, pollution and climate burden. And then our last purple bucket there is demographics, and that includes things like the percent people of color, educational attainment, percent disability, linguistic isolation, and other characteristics that can contribute to that sort of social determinant of health framework. And so all of these get combined, and you can see that when all of this information gets combined, each of the individual groupings get kind of diluted into the overall cumulative score. So we're really able to get a more complex picture of what's going on across the state. So many of you may be wondering how this tool is being used. While it only launched at the end of June of this year, we already have a lot of users within CDPHE and across sort of the state ecosystem. So within CDPHE, a lot of our environmental programs are utilizing the tool to change how they issue permits, by identifying communities where perhaps additional public outreach may be required. A lot of our enforcement, compliance, and inspection programs are utilizing the tool to schedule their programmatic activities throughout the state to make sure that those communities who may have been overlooked historically are getting, the priority attention. In terms of funding, that Environmental Justice Advisory Board that Ronnie mentioned will be allocating environmental justice grants in the spring using the tool. And then the environmental programs as a whole will be utilizing the tool to help inform public engagement on environmental regulations. Other state agencies have similar disproportionately impacted community definitions. And so the fact that we've got that demographic component of the DI community definition mapped on our tool means that a lot of other agencies are utilizing it for their requirements as well. But we've also heard from Marguerite about the potential for using EnviroScreen in her programming. And we know that the Colorado Department of Early Childhood is utilizing it to allocate funding for indoor air filters among childcare facilities throughout the state. So it's really exciting to see how this tool is being utilized for programmatic decision making. And then outside of the state ecosystem, we're really encouraging local public health authorities to engage with the tool. A number of academic institutions are interested in it. And ultimately, it's an environmental justice tool that we hope is useful and relevant for communities affected by environmental justice issues. So time will tell how the tool gets utilized long term, but it's here, and we're really excited for it to be shared out with the communities and throughout the state. I'm going to turn it back over to Ronnie to talk a little bit about some of these discussion topics that we thought would be relevant given the topic of today's session. I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, I think we've seen some questions too in the chat that reflect this, but that especially when we're talking about when we're looking at environmental justice, like the need for community level data, and then talking in order to make a full picture of what's happening for an environmental justice issue or area. And so I think we're really sort of in that space of data and policy and how those all tie together. I think when you look at other environmental justice tools throughout the United States, there's a lot of similarities in the way, using ACS data as a part of the demographic component. But if you look at, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency's EJ screen, they have already updated to the 2016-2020 ACS data, and their stance, last I heard from them on, data reliability for some of that data is sort of that's responsibility of the Census Bureau, and people should direct questions about that data to the Census Bureau. So when you get to the smaller state level, talking about, I think Dr. Cog does a really great presentation and talking about how do we incorporate specifically for census data, data reliability into future versions of our tool, or for making these decisions at the state level. And I think, yeah, Margaret, did you have anything you wanted to maybe chime in on those topics?
I think I would just, echo something that you said earlier about the sheer quantity of environmental justice tools that are in development or that are out already just within the US. This is a really exciting space where a lot of states are creating their own tools because of that, local need for, locally relevant data. And so we're kind of in this interesting time where a lot of different programs are innovating and creating new tools and finding new ways to display data and to address these data challenges that we're all facing. So the Washington State Legislature, I think I'm not sure when, but they commissioned a report from their Public Policy Institute to review the Washington State Environmental Justice Tool as it compares to a number of other EJ tools. So that report was just published, and it does a really great job of laying out, I think, 5 or 6 different environmental justice tools. What do they map? How are they different? How are they accounting for some of these challenges? And that's a really great place to start if anybody's interested in the environmental justice topic, and how, you know, data, policy, and mapping are all coming together in all of these different tools and locations.
Yeah, and on that note, if you go to the next slide, we this is available in the slides to download, but we put a lot of resources out there. Again, we want to kind of give back time to the group to discuss, but if you're specifically interested in the development of Colorado EnviroScreen, that reports, guides, and resources link is where I would go. It was about a year-long process. We have a community engagement report that also goes into that. So I saw a question in the chat about like, how were these determined and who did the work? Again, it was CDPHE in collaboration with other state agencies and also with that Colorado State team. So you can get a full read on the exact development of Colorado EnviroScreen if you go to that folder, and encourage people to look more into the task force work as well. That's wrapping up next week. So we'll turn it back to you, Elizabeth.
Super, you know, very interesting tool and discussion of what you've pulling together, and again, using these resources from across the United States and what other states have done. I'm gonna question Kim Davis. I don't know if she was gonna go into a little bit further demonstration of any of the census data, but if not, she kind of referenced some of the equity tools that are out there. Kim, you want to come off mute and just let me know where you are?
Hi, yes. No, first of all, I love this tool. This is great. I love what you guys are doing. But I was just going to share, and you can share it in the notes since we're close on time, the data equity tools. I did point them out earlier in my session, but I was just going to talk about 3 that might be useful. And again, you can send those in the notes. No worries.
Oh, no. And if you wanted to demo them, and I know you kind of talked about them a little bit earlier, but I think people can go and play. We've played with them. I think they're very easy and they're out there. And I don't know if you want to pull any of them up. I know we've got a couple of questions, so I don't know if you can keep it just a couple of minutes of showing some of those equity tools. And then I'll invite everybody to get back on off mute and their faces.
Okay, so yeah, I'll go through this kind of quick. So at the Census Bureau, we have compiled into a single tabulation data equity tools. And the effort of the Census Bureau is to provide demographic data tools, and data tools that provide public assistance program metrics. We also provide the diversity measurements in the data. And then, of course, our goal is always to inform people about the data available at the Census Bureau, so we provide data education. Of that suite of tools, one of them that was really engineered based on the Presidential Executive Order 13985 on diversity, equity, and inclusion is the My Community Explorer. And I want to point out all these tools are always in agile development. We're always looking at what are the needs and taking feedback from the users. But this particular tool has 4 interfaces. I'm sorry, 5, including the map. But on the interactive map, we have the score that recognizes the communities and the vulnerability and the risk factors for communities. We have this available on the interactive map, and then we also provide economic profiles, social characteristics, and at the county level, there's the race and ethnicity, and then at the county level, the business profile. So it's a nice interface to look at everything in one tool. But this particular tool, I drew up the economic profile so you can see it's not always a mapping interface. It does give the actual details about the data in the interface. And this one is looking at Colorado in particular. My Community Explorer, when it initially was put out, was to look at the potential areas of impact. So we looked at what was interfaced here was programs that were predictive areas that were going to be impacted, such as hurricanes. When the prediction was coming, then they could look at, here are the risk factors, here are the accountabilities for this. But recently they have added other impacts, and it does include wildfires, which impacts Colorado. And it does bring that data into it to show, and I just took a screenshot where you can look at the risk factor, and it goes back to the date of a wildfire. They only do 4 days at this point, looking back, because it's really meant for predictability. But it does show where things have been impacted on, and include those back dating for 4 days on current incidents. The other one is the Community Resilience Estimates tool, and that's exactly what this tool is. It is to project and to look at the resilience of a community in an area, and it does it at that higher level. These the community resilience estimates are based also with the 3 characteristic risk factors, 0 at low, 1 to 2 a moderate risk, and 3 at a higher risk. This is available down to a track level. So you can start your search out at the state and county, and then scroll in on the map and look at those track levels. But it does include the 2019 ACS variables in combination with the estimates programs. Details are also included on this website for the technical documentation. And here I was just showing you kind of when you scroll in on it, looking at the particular county, the information that comes up in the pop-ups that users can look at on the fly and do comparisons. And the next tool I wanted to focus a little bit on is the Income and Poverty interactive data tool. This is generated from the small area income and poverty estimates. And it's really just a quick high-level view to look at data for the poverty estimates at the school district, county, and state level. And then you can look at median household incomes at the county and state. It doesn't provide that at the school district, but it's a great quick way to look at those poverty rates with a few of the variables that include ages, breaking down to ages under 18 and the 5 to 17 variables. This next slide I'm going to show you, I do want to point out, it is incredibly hard to read, but I left it that way for a reason. This is looking at the school districts in Colorado, so I wanted to emphasize how many there are. And when you actually use this tool, when you hover over the line in it, it gives you information. So I would be surprised if any of you can read these lines, but the very top one here at this teal line is Douglas County. And what this is showing is the median household income. We're at the very bottom, we're looking at Castilla County. And that orange line indicator is about 35,600 for the income, where Douglas County is at 122, over 122,000 for the median household income. So I just wanted to point those out, that those are quick grab tools for you all to look at. when you're looking at data that may help with some of your data equity. And that's all that I had, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much for sharing that. And what we'll do is if we'll bring everybody from this panel back kind of together, turn on your face, on your, be able to turn on your mics if needed. First of all, I want to thank all of you guys. I think all of the work that you guys are doing is amazing and very, very interesting. And I think something that a lot of us can leverage throughout the state, whether it's information at the Census Bureau, the stuff that Kim was sharing, or all of the work that CDPHE has done with EnviroScreen, all the work that Marguerite is doing in terms of trying to just run a program and seeing how do you engage. Certainly all of the work that Dr. Cog has done in terms of valuation. So there aren't a ton of, I know we're over a little bit, but I'm going to take 5 minutes prerogative as director and ask a couple of questions because I think a couple of things came up. Certainly Dion kind of started off with like, how do we start big? How do we really just identify the communities, work with the communities, not like the dog, as Marguerite said, the tail wag the dog, which is definitely what I say all the time. So we don't get too bogged, but that we also focus. I know that people like block groups. I know how bad that data is. Have any of you looked at using the range of the margin of error into acceptable numbers for whatever criteria you're looking at? Because to be honest, that is the truth, is that the range is somewhere in that margin of error. I'd be curious, CDPHE, have you been looking at that? Either
Well,
Margaret or
I might
Ronnie?
put Margaret on the spot just to talk kind of generally, not at a planned level yet, but just California EnviroScreen does have reliability criteria different than what Dr. Cog does. And so we've looked into that. So Margaret, do you want to speak maybe broadly to that concept?
Yeah, so we haven't looked specifically at, incorporating the margin of error into the range of allowable values or sort of the range of areas that meet the criteria given that range. But the California EnviroScreen reliability metric utilizes the standard error from the margin of error, which is a lot less stringent than the Dr. Cog approach. And so, I think there's a lot more digging into reliability methodologies that could be done in EnviroScreen. And I think it would be great to look at that entire range and see how that changes things one way or another. So it's definitely on our to-do list moving forward. It's a great idea.
How about, so kind of pointing at Dr. Cog a little bit, I felt that your view of margin of error is bad in a way, like it's a negative, like not usable, rather than the concept of breadth of usability. Thoughts on how you might incorporate looking at the entire range as an acceptable level?
I think the point we're at now is we are kind of maybe doing some data work before we're making decisions on how to use it. And so I'm thinking that once we get to the point where we know how we're going to use it to assess our transportation programs, we'll have a better idea of what might be an acceptable range. Because if we're looking at like aggregating across many tracts, for example, that could be one way. But if we're looking to try to get specific thresholds, that might be another story for the reliability. And so one idea that we've been having recently would be, we have no other data, no other data to use. And so going with tracts is a good start. But then beyond that, if there is a way to look at those anomalous values, if you have 2019 ACS says there's 100 people in the group here, but then 2020 says there's like 400 or something, kind of like Todd was showing in Lake County, where those values were so different. If there was a way that we could kind of catch those anomalies as another way of deciding whether to screen data or to, I don't know, use it differently, or decide if that data is too wacky to use. But yeah, I think unfortunately at this point, we haven't gotten far enough in our process to come to a decision about acceptable ranges. Long story short, but we will keep you updated.
So I'm glad you brought up Lake, because I'm now going to pick on both Marguerite and maybe Dion. Let's say you're working with Lake County. You see all of the variety of they're in, they're out, they're in, they're out, they're in, they're out. How would you work with them? Maybe start with Marguerite first, and then kind of look at what would leadership potentially recommend?
Yeah, I think in a planning process, it comes back to that story that it's telling, which is that there are vulnerabilities in this community. And let's break down those indicators into more specific metrics. What is it? Is it poverty? Is it economy? Is it household? Is it affordable housing? And that guide the discussion rather than like getting into the weeds of it wasn't, is it vulnerable? The story that tells is a much broader brush that I think that data can inform. You have data backing up that story to anyone who question that, but I think it's not necessarily about those details, and it's more about that bigger story to me. I think with a grant program, it is a little bit stickier, because if you are giving it point-based selection criteria on if they're disadvantaged or not, that's tricky. And I think that as we develop that out more for the grant program I'll be overseeing, we're going to have to think about that criteria and how strict we're going to be. And I don't want to deduct points too much for details like that. And so I'll be setting up an appointment with you, Elizabeth and Todd, and you'll get to help me in that answer. So questions coming back to you later.
And I can
Dion?
weigh in.
Yeah.
I can weigh in, and it really is just supporting what Marguerite is saying. In a county like Lake County, we have a lot of indicators that we can use, but even if the county's data kind of drops in and out, I think that narrative really is key, is really understanding what questions to ask in community and how you use the responses to those questions to determine how you will sort of index what's going on in that community. And it may not always be a really solid data source. It's interesting you mentioned Lake County, because we had a lot of success there, in particular with our rental assistance program last year, where the county, because we had partnerships with some of the community organizations that support renters and workforce housing in the community, we were able to connect people to services and connect people to receive benefits in that county at a higher proportion than the surrounding counties. And we did that through kind of understanding that narrative for Lake County and connecting with some of the partners in the county. And the data is sometimes there to back that up, but I think that narrative piece and really understanding what story you're trying to understand in any particular community is key to that.
No, yeah, I totally appreciate that, which to me sounds like you want to build some flexibility into how do you use data, but also be able to tell a story. So I'm curious with EnviroScreen, is there some flexibility in there? Have you been thinking about that component? And in addition, I'm going to add a little more nugget in there. Because it's a tool that has multiple factors, did you do any analysis to see if any of the factors nullified each other? Like, let's say they were low income, but had really clean water. And so because of that, they were out of the mix.
Well, I'll pass it to Margaret, because she was there for a lot of the development of the tool itself. But I think I want to frame too that it's a really tough spot, especially specifically talking about environmental justice. The push for the EJ Act really came from environmental justice activists needing needing tools and data transparency from the state of Colorado of, what actions are going to be taken. And so I think there is that line of, metrics that are clear and open for communities so they can understand what decisions are being made. And so when you see these environmental justice mapping tools, that's a huge underlying piece of it, is it being informed by community and what communities want. And so I guess, that's just this interesting line where this all sort of comes together. But with Colorado EnviroScreen specifically, it was built really based on state agency input, but also community input. There was a lot of, there were focus groups, and there was a bunch of work done on the indicator selectors. So not just from, the data point, but from what do Colorado communities want when they were talking about environmental justice. So that broader picture of what is environmental justice and how do we achieve that in Colorado, I think is sort of the big underlying push for a lot of these initiatives. But on like an epidemiological side, I know that we had Dr. David Rojas, who is the sort of epidemiologist who was, pulling the strings a little bit of thinking through those indicators and how they all combine together. So I guess, Margaret, feel free to add on to all of that, but how do these indicators weigh up together when they come to a final score?
Yeah, so I'll do my best to try to communicate what the score is displaying. It's really based on a series of percentile rankings. And so if a community rates really high or has a lot of water violations, for example, but it has very few low income people, that will kind of balance out. So each of the 35 individual indicators are given a percentile for each community in the state. And so if there's a community that consistently ranks, 80th percentile across all 35 indicators, we're really going to be able to see that extreme accumulation of, those cumulative factors in that area. And so I think, to me, the strength of the tool is the high end and the low end of the EnviroScreen scores, because that's where we're really seeing consistent burden in things like environmental pollution, climate burden, and those sociodemographic factors and health factors. So I think that the key takeaway from EnviroScreen is that it is a screening tool intended to find those areas that across the board experience the highest burden of all of those factors combined.
Perfect. No, I think that that's really helpful. So that really does build in this idea that it is this rank concept, which I think is helpful when people are trying to use a tool, is to understand really how it's working. So I know we're terribly over time, not terribly, 10 minutes, almost 15. I want to thank you guys for everything. I will let it open, see if you guys have any questions for each other real quickly. If not, we will end the summit for today. All right, I will just, I missed
just
that.
saying thanks.
Oh.
Just saying thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you guys. I hope you guys know that Colorado is really lucky to have all of you guys doing all of the great work that you are doing across the state. So thank you for your time, especially on a Friday afternoon, for spending time with us, for creating the wonderful tools. And for everybody else in the audience, I want to thank you for participating with us today. It's been a ton of fun. And remember that there is an evaluation tool there's a link, will be open in 1 second for people to fill out. Again, if you're looking for continuing education credits, you need to fill it out to be able to get the credits. But even if you aren't, we need your feedback. You help us decide how we're going to engage next year, and the content and the topics and the speakers, etc. So please fill out those evaluation forms so we know how we're doing in our work. And otherwise, happy Friday and happiest 40 summits. And we will see you next year for 41. Take care. Bye-bye.